Good evening. My name is Adele West Fisher, and I'm the coordinator of library services here at the Athenaeum. And I want to thank you for coming to our first arts and culture presentation this year. Now, just a quick housekeeping item or two. For those of you who are not familiar with the Athenaeum, we do have bathroom facilities in the basement. It is through that back door, down the elevator to the basement, take a left. And if you would please, before we get started, silence your cell phones so that we can pay all of our attention to our presenter. Before we start, though, I do want to bring your attention to an event that's happening next week. You can't see at the moment, but behind this screen there is an exhibit. Tara Garreau, the artist, will be here next week, Wednesday, March 15th at 7 o'clock. This will be another arts and culture presentation. She will talk about her exhibit, which features her recent mural created with the help from the community for the Caledonia Food Co-op. A reception will follow. Okay. For current and future events at the Athenaeum, if you would just go to our website, and we'll have all our events there. And then for any additional information you would like, you can just contact the Athenaeum, and we will do our best to answer your questions. Moving ahead to our presentation for tonight, I am so pleased that I do get to introduce Kevin Cattrell, partly because I do have a history with graphic novels and comic books. As a media specialist in Florida, when I took over that library, I thought to myself, why are these comic books here in my library? And I didn't have a large respect. I didn't feel like they had a lot of substance. But as I have become more familiar with them and as they have evolved, they really are addressing a number of sophisticated topics that I don't recall ever experiencing before. In fact, we have expanded our collection here at the Athenaeum as well. If Kevin piques your interest for nonfiction comics in the classroom, I do have some nonfiction graphic novels over here to right on the other side of Mr. Jolly. It's The Most Costly Journey. It is the Vermont Reads book for the year, but it is a nonfiction graphic novel, and you are welcome to take those. Those are free. I really want to thank Kevin Cattrell for being with us tonight as he presents Art, Witness, and Therapy Nonfiction Comics in the English Classroom. Kevin is an English and Humanities teacher at St. Johnsbury Academy, where his courses include a senior elective on graphic narrative that first ran in the fall of 2022. He has a Ph.D. in English from Rutgers, where he specialized in early American literature. Kevin, welcome to the Athenaeum.
Well, thanks for coming, everybody. I want to give a thanks to Bob and to Adele for welcoming me here. And over the summer, as I was looking through the collection of graphic narratives, Adele saw me and touched base and told me about The Most Costly Journey, which I'd never heard of. And so I'm deeply grateful for her, for introducing me to that. And then she also got copies for St. Johnsbury Academy students to use. And so last semester we read it, and then this semester we're going to read it as well. And so I'm really grateful for that. I'm by no means an expert on comics. I'm still learning a lot. But I wanted to share with you some of the things I've learned in trying to teach comics over the last year. And up on the screen, on the far left, there is a hand drawing of a comic scholar by the name of Hilary Chute, who's been had a huge influence on my understanding of comics. And my wife, Margaret, who's in the audience tonight, and I both went to graduate school with Hilary. And she's written a number of books about graphic narrative, including Disaster Drawn, that I think is just a work of genius. And so her influence is here, even if I won't explicitly mention her. So I wanted to start by looking at some lyrics from a great 1980s sort of battle-style track by Big Daddy Kane, one of the greatest chest-thumping hip-hop tracks of all time. And in this track, in one of the verses, he draws an opposition between reality and cartoons. And these lines always remind me that cartoons tend to get a hard rap. They tend to be accused of falling either short of reality because they're crude and they're hand-drawn and they don't quite have the level of realist detail of a photograph. On the other hand, they're also accused of being caricatures and being exaggerations. So they exceed reality as well. In the 1950s is arguably the low point in the history of comics in the United States. And that was in 1954, the psychiatrist Frederick Wertham published this book called The Seduction of the Innocent, which was essentially a book-length attack on comics. And Wertham's a really interesting figure. He was progressive. He wrote some studies of segregation that were cited by the plaintiffs in the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case from the same year. And yet he really saw comics as being deleterious to America's youth. And he famously wrote that consuming comics, not reading comics, but consuming them, is an evasion of reading and almost its opposite. And so what is the opposite of reading is one question I have. But as a result of that, the Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency, which had formed the year before, had hearings. They invited Wertham to testify. And the result was that the comics industry produced their version of the Hollywood Hays Code, which was the Comics Code from 1954. And infamously, the Comics Code made it so that the good guy always won. Bad guy could never triumph. That there really could be no critique of institutional authority. In fact, even, I'm not sure if I put this on the slide, but even divorce could not be talked about in a lighthearted way. And they even had stipulations about the use of good grammar and that sort of thing. There are some nice things about the Comic Code. The second to last item there says ridicule or attack on any religious or racial group is never permissible, which is well-intentioned, but unfortunately, a lot of comics artists felt like their hands were tied. And it was a dark moment for comics history. So comics scholars and practitioners like Scott McCloud have dealt with comics' bad reputation. They have to deal with it in a way. We're going to talk a little bit more about understanding comics, the work that this is an excerpt from. But early on, and my students today were actually reading this in class. This is fun to see this again. But McCloud talks about being a young man in 8th grade, discovering comics, discovering what their worth was, and then trying to start writing them when he was in 10th grade. And he was frustrated at the way people laughed at him when he said that that was his ambition, to be a comics artist. And he makes a major concession for a comics artist. He says that, I realized that comic books were usually crude, poorly drawn, semi-literate, cheap, disposable, kiddie fare. It's just that they don't have to be. One of the things I love about this tier in understanding comics is that final panel there, which, with no context whatsoever, just draws a scene from a bar in which one man says to the other, "Don't give me that comic book talk, Barney," and is able to sort of conjure up a whole scenario. In defense of comics. So there's a wonderful way in which McCloud's use of comics is the rebuttal to the notion that comics is what he says it is, often over on the left-hand side, crude, semi-literate, cheap. It's anything but that. It can sort of conjure a world right away. And I'm not sure if this image is enlarged enough, but the great Joe Sacco, the comics journalist, in his most recent book called Paying the Land, is talking to a Dene man from Canada's Northwest Territories about fracking. He's interviewing him about that. And when the man he's interviewing learns that Joe Sacco makes cartoons, he says to him, "Look, fracking is not a cartoon. It's not a joke." He seems to think that cartooning is jokes. And then Art Spiegelman here, as he was writing his masterwork, Mouse, in the 1970s, embraces the qualities that McCloud says people disparage comics for. He says maybe vulgar, semi-literate, unsubtle comic books are an appropriate form for speaking the unspeakable. And I love the fact that Spiegelman is not trying to defend comics against these charges. He says, no, those things that people accuse comics of being are actually assets to artists. We can use them for good things. In a moment, we'll talk a little bit about how he tries to do that. I taught Mouse for many years. And when I did so, I was always unsure about how to jump in. How do I start teaching graphic narrative in a course that is about other forms of literature and more conventional and more familiar ones? And so the first strategy that I hit on was to compare comics to poetry, and especially poems that make creative use of the space, as this one does, Imagist poems and modernist poems tend to do. And this is one of my favorites by William Carlos Williams, a single sentence. As the cat climbs over the top of the jam closet, first the right forefoot carefully, then the hind stepped down into the round of the empty flower pot. I'm not a cat person, but I love this poem. And there's so many things that one can do with this poem, and I'll just note two of them in a very nerdy way. On the one hand, that word jam closet to me suggests the term enjambment. It's a technical term about the continuation of the unit of syntax across a line or a stanza break. And it comes from the French enjamber, pardon my French pronunciation, which means to step over, which is perfect in this poem, which is about a cat stepping over something, over the top of a jam cupboard or a jam closet. And there's also the fact that the last two-thirds of the poem, the bulk of it, is about the cat's descent. And so just as our eye traces the downward progress of the poem, which is sharper than usual in a poem because the lines are so short, we're following the cat's descent as we move our eye down the poem. And that was my safe way into comics, thinking about the way that poets were using the space of the page. We don't have to dwell on this one. Then I would combine poetry and painting, as in this great Basho haiku, the famous one on the bare branch, a crow has alighted autumn nightfall, which has an accompanying painting with it as well. And it wasn't until this year, teaching a course on graphic narrative at St. Johnsbury, that I started to think about maybe I was asking the wrong question. And that instead of asking myself what familiar, conventional literary objects is comics similar to, what I needed to ask was what can comics do that other media cannot? And so in order to pursue this question, I'm going to show two images of the September 11th, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center in New York. And the first one is one that probably a lot of us saw the day after the attacks. It was published in the New York Times, part of a Pulitzer Prize-winning effort, the New York Times photojournalist, and it's taken by Kelly Gwenther. And Gwenther lived not far from the Brooklyn Heights Promenade. So when she saw that on the news that a plane had crashed into the North Tower, she went downstairs with her camera equipment to take pictures. And as you can see in the part that's highlighted in blue, there was a point at which, as her partner pointed out another plane coming over New York Harbor, Gwenther realized that another impact might happen, and so she had to steady herself, keep her hands still, wait for the plane to come into the frame, and then snap this picture. And here's another image that was made at essentially the same time, and it's by the comics artist Gary Panter. He lived in Williamsburg, so a few neighborhoods away, but he went up to the roof of his building at 150 Roebling Street and began sketching what he saw. As it says on the bottom of the page there, he would have started the drawing a few minutes before the second plane, United Airlines 175, hit the South Tower. And so you can see actually the impact in the South Tower in the drawing. My thought here was to have the audience give their thoughts about these two images. I put them side by side in this slide, and I'm curious what you think. What does one image capture that the other one doesn't, and vice versa? And what do the images tell us, respectively, about the people who made them and about the images, how the images themselves were made? I'm hoping some folks might join in. Mr. Acker.
Notice that in the right image, the cartoon, the bridges, it's not an island like on the left.
Okay.
There's a connection that isn't as present. I don't know. It's a different.
All right. Wonderful. Yeah. The Williamsburg Bridge in the foreground there. Yeah.
GW in the back.
I find it really painful to look at the left one, because you do know exactly what's going to happen, and you can't quite read. I don't think I've ever seen that image, and that was so shocking, that event, to have captured it like that, and the photographer waited till the plane came in, so she was saying, this is what I do, and she made that amazing photo. And I find the left image more tolerable for me, because maybe because it's a drawing.
All right. So it makes it approachable. The fact that it's hand-drawn makes it approachable for me.
Yep.
Okay.
And it's somebody's rendering, not like a photograph, but the left one is almost too real for me.
I see.
trying to give a sense of the scope and detail when clearly there's something that he's so focused on, and so taking the time and spending like the energy to ground the scene, something that the image doesn't have to.
I see. Okay. Yeah, that's wonderful. Margaret.
Maybe it's because I'm familiar with the left image as much as I am, and because it's a photograph, it feels oddly still. It is very static, despite the smoke. Whereas because of the types, like it would be different if the drawing were just a line drawing without any shading or anything, but because there's so much movement in the right image, it feels much more dynamic, much more, actually for me, much more real. The one on the left almost looks like somebody photoshopped an image. Here, put a plane over there.
Okay. Interesting. I want to go back a little bit and just point out what Gary Panter says. He said this years later, about a decade later, at a conference in Chicago, but he said he was actually crying and screaming and falling down while he was drawing these images. And I'm always struck at the fact that Gwenther says something quite the opposite. She said, she uses the word freezing, and she also talks about having to keep still, having to keep her composure, whereas Panter did not. And to go back to that notion of frozenness as well, yeah, that this is a particular image just when the shutter clicks, whereas Panter's expands across a whole duration of time, during which something else terrible happens, which is the collision with the South Tower. And so, while if I were pressed, and sometimes my students ask if you had to choose which of these two images, which one would you choose? I would choose the one on the left. I would want the objective, or as objective as possible, rendering of what happened on that day. But I love what the one on the right contributes. And I love the fact that it's so subjective. Gary Panter's famous for having a very wobbly line in his comics. He's a great draftsman, but he often has very wobbly characters, and it's all the more so in this image. You can tell that someone's feeling something as they've written, as they've made the image. And there's a long tradition in comics history or in the history of sequential art of drawings of disturbing events. And probably one of the most influential ones I've discovered in my research is a series of drawings made by Francisco Goya about the Peninsular War, and in particular about the Spanish War of Independence against French forces in the early 19th century. And this is a famous print from that series, which was uncommissioned and wasn't published until a few decades after Goya's death. But the caption just reads very simply in Spanish, "Yo lo vi." I saw it. I'm not exactly certain what this image represents. There are other ones that are truly horrifying, that have disembowelments and castrations and things like this. But Goya clearly thought it was valuable and important to document some of the atrocities that were taking place. And that term, "I saw it," was used also by Keiji Nakazawa in his great 1972 atomic bomb manga, which was a clip of which we see here. It's also, that work of comics, about 50 pages long, was published in a boys' magazine. And it was one of the first public expressions by a Japanese person who survived an atomic bomb blast of what life was like. And I've spared you some of the most graphic scenes in this comic, which I will say has some of the images that I find most disturbing that I've ever seen, and devastating. But it's a pretty powerful work of witnessing, and a really valuable one, and one for which no other medium really could do what Nakazawa makes comics do. No one had cameras ready, as Kelly Gwenther did, to photograph what was happening. I'd like to spend the next part of the talk, and the rest of the talk really, talking about a really specific element of comics. So going back to that question, what can comics do that other media can't? I'd like to talk about this technical term that's called closure. And it's a term that Scott McCloud, who I mentioned a little bit earlier, defines and explains in the 3rd chapter of his book, Understanding Comics. And the title of that chapter, very provocatively, is Blood in the Gutter. And although this work is 30 years old, it's still considered a masterpiece of comics theory, and wonderfully it's in comics form. MacLeod introduces the idea of closure by talking about a childhood memory, which, oh, there we go. All right, in this childhood, he had this fantasy about how the world might disappear if he weren't there to witness it. So everywhere he turned his head, things were just sort of appearing out of oblivion. And when he turned away, they would disappear again. And then MacLeod makes the perception that when we're perceiving things, we're usually engaging our faith, and that there's only so much we can see. And so our perception has a lot to do with our memory, our past experiences, our knowledge, and really our trust that what we see is part of a larger whole. And as a demonstration of that, he's got this wonderful tier, or this kind of page-width panel where he talks about the game of peekaboo. And he talks about how as infants, we don't have the ability really to register what we don't, or rather to understand what we don't register with our senses. And so the peekaboo game would lose its edge. It wouldn't really work if the infant understood that his mother was still there when she held the blanket over her face, but the look of distress on his face is because, oh, I can't see her, so she must not be there. And so MacLeod defines closure as the phenomenon, as he says, of observing the parts but perceiving the whole. And then, Blood in the Gutter, the title of the chapter, becomes apparent when he shows two panels in a piece that he makes up that involves an axe murder. A little later in this presentation, we're going to watch someone peeling potatoes, so this is about as exciting as it will get. But, and he talks about the gutter. For MacLeod, he doesn't say it in this book, but in another interview, he does say that he thinks that the gutter is a feature of comics that exists in no other art form. And it's just the space between panels. And often it's visible and wide, as the white space between those two panels at the top is. But sometimes it's just a single line, and sometimes it's not even there at all. And he says that despite its unceremonious title, the gutter plays host to much of the magic and mystery that are at the heart of comics. Because there, he says, is where the imagination of the reader takes over, and it converts two separate images into a single idea. A little further into the chapter, MacLeod goes a step further, and he argues that in a very real sense, comics is closure. It's a bold statement, and it's one that I think he makes on purpose to sort of provoke people to disagree with and engage him with. Understanding comic makes a lot of really bold claims, but it's also, I think, a wonderfully humble and down-to-earth work. So this is a pretty dramatic moment. In a very real sense, comics is closure, he says, and he has some fun with it. He accuses us of being accomplices to the murder that he's depicted on the previous page. He says, I may have drawn an axe being raised in this example, but I'm not the one who let it drop, or decided how hard the blow, or who screamed or why. All of you, that is us, the readers, participated in the murder. All of us held the axe and chose our spot. And so, once again, there he is saying, in a very real sense, comics is closure. A little bit out of order here. And so I'd like to consider how closure works in a couple of book-length works of comics. And then at the very end, I will turn to consider two comics from The Most Costly Journey. But here is Spiegelman again. And Maus, just to go back to that, I should see a show of hands. How many folks here are familiar with Maus? All right, okay. All right, so a lot of folks are. But Maus was published between 1980 and 1991. The first volume of Maus came out in 1986. It was the first six chapters. And then the second volume was published in 1991. And it was a pretty big success. The probably most defining feature of Maus is the anthropomorphic animal metaphor that he uses throughout Maus. So in it, Jewish characters of any national origin are always drawn as anthropomorphic mice, and then Polish non-Jews are drawn as pigs or humans with pig heads. German non-Jews are drawn as cats. American non-Jews are drawn as dogs. In volume 2, in the second chapter, Spiegelman sort of breaks the frame. Most of the book is about his interviews of his father Wladek during Wladek's experiences in the Holocaust, in Eastern Poland mostly, and also he ends up in Dachau in Germany, and a few other spots. And then, so it's sort of two timelines at once. The timeline of collecting the information, the son talking to his father about his experiences and recording them, and then also, of course, Wladek's experiences. And Spiegelman moves seamlessly between them. At this point, however, he introduces another timeline, and it's the timeline of composition, the present tense of composition. And he does a number of interesting things in this panel that I want to sort of focus on right here. First, we should note that he uses conventional transitions between his panels to set up the kind of closure that MacLeod was talking about. Wonderfully, not much happens in the panel, but by using closure, we can understand that there's an artist sitting at a drafting table, reaches his hand forward to draw something, apparently doesn't draw anything, reaches it back, turns to address us, turns back, slumps down and has folded his arms, right? As I say, not much happens there, but we can use closure to understand what little action there is. And so that's a conventional sense of closure. But of course, at the very start, we see in the background a fly. And in the next panel, we see a few more. And gradually more and more flies. And by the time we reach the end of the page, we see also that there's a kind of closure that happens between the first 4 panels and the last panel, the largest one, which is equal in size to the first 4. And that's the closure of understanding that those flies that are in the background come from rotting corpses, and rotting corpses of Jewish people. There's a reference to Auschwitz in the third panel, which makes us think perhaps that it's corpses of people who've died in Auschwitz. And so, although the image on the page can be grasped as a whole, its parts are a little bit out of joint. Art Spiegelman is writing this in New York City. He tells us in 1987. The corpses seem to come from the 1940s from somewhere in Europe, perhaps Auschwitz or Auschwitz in Poland. And there's a guard tower in the background on the bottom of the page too. So that there is sort of a counterpoint between the kind of closure that we use to understand how action works in a comic and the yoking together or the combining of elements that don't actually go together. And it's a little bit troubling. And so, in a larger sense, this whole page is about mismatches too, fragments that are really difficult to combine into a coherent whole, which is what happens with closure. If we look at the second panel, he pairs, without any explanation of the relationship between the two things, Wladek's occupation, his father's occupation in 1944 in Auschwitz, and his own occupation. Wladek started working as a tin man in Auschwitz in the spring of '44. I started working on this page at the very end of February 1987. And then the next panel makes another pairing, but this one is much harder to describe the relationship between the two parts of. In the first one, it's 2 different occupations. In the second one, he says, in May 1987, Francoise and I are expecting a baby. Between May 16th, 1944 and May 24th, 1944, over 100,000 Hungarian Jews were gassed in Auschwitz. And so those two things, as I said before, are really difficult for me to reconcile into any kind of a whole. There's a contrast between them, to be sure, but there's a difference in scale, there's a difference in duration, and it's such a disturbing pairing of ideas that it's really hard to resolve. And so one of the things I think that makes this page powerful, and Maus powerful in general, is that we'll often have these sort of contrary emotions within it. The limited action in the panel makes sense. We can understand it through closure as we work our way down. But then there's also a bunch of things that just don't actually fit together. And that makes a difference in this moment, because this is the moment where Spiegelman is trying to explain why he has suddenly stopped. He can't continue writing Maus anymore. He's finding it hard to move forward in a work that he is profiting personally and professionally from, when he knows that its source is in this tragedy that's cost far, far, far more than the 100,000 people he mentions in the third panel here. So that if, as MacLeod says, that comics is closure, And to a large extent, I think he's right. Comics can also be at its most powerful when it really resists or challenges or refuses closure. That is when it's closure and it's the opposite of closure at the same time. Let's see how we're doing for time here, 7:32. I'm going to talk about a slightly different work that I discovered here in the Athenaeum. And so I'm really grateful again that you have this collection, and we ended up buying copies of the book for the book room in St. Johnsbury. My students will start reading this once we're done with understanding comics in a little bit here. But it's by the French artist Elodie Durand. It was published in French in 2010, and I think 2016 or 2021 was the English version. And it is about her suffering from and then her treatment from an astrocytoma brain tumor that caused epilepsy and then also caused major memory loss. And so, like Mouse, parenthesis is also about the sort of the present tense of collecting the information that the artist uses to make the book. But what's strange and interesting about parenthesis is that Elodie Durand, the author, is both a person doing the research like Art Spiegelman in Mouse, but she's also like Vladek Spiegelman in Mouse, the person that she's also, she's like Vladek Spiegelman in the sense that it's her story that's being told, but she has to interview other people to find out what she was doing during those times because she's lost so much of her memory. And so the comic is set up on the first page with a frame of a letter that she's writing to her mother. And she talks about, on the right-hand side there, how her memories shift and change with time and feelings. And what she wants to do is to sort them out, put them in order, so she can hang on to them and not have to think about them anymore. As the book progresses, however, it's clear that there's a lot she's forgotten, and that her parents and her friends and her sister have to correct her from. So she's reliant upon the testimony of doctors like these, in this really memorable 2-page spread, who are thinking about her brain, and they don't really know her all that well. They're trying to make decisions and trying to figure out what it is they need to do to treat the astrocytoma, and then also members of her family as well. Durand, I think, does a beautiful job using the principle of closure to show how disoriented she is at a number of different points. In this page, she is trying to write a master's thesis on art history, but she tells us that all she can do is rearrange the same 4 words about the American artist Robert Motherwell again and again, and she does that for 2 months. She is not able to make a transition from one set of words to something like a sentence. She can't just assemble the parts together. She, unfortunately, at this point has become cognitively incapable of doing that, even though she's still capable of seeming to her family and friends as if she is functioning as she always had. Deeper into her treatment, so once she gets what's called a gamma knife treatment, which is where I think 200 or so different cobalt rays are directed at the brain. Mr. Eckel could probably say more about this than I could. And any one of them, my understanding is that any one of them does not damage the brain tissue by itself, but when they're combined, it has the strength to, all of them together to destroy a tumor. The tumor is about the size of her small fingernail. And so after she undergoes that treatment, she has the most severe memory loss that she ever has in the book. And she tells in the white script sort of on the bottom of this page, one of the wonderful things about this book is every page that's solid black, and there's a lot of them, are solid black filled in by hand. She says, there was no such thing as time anymore as chronology, just a giant emptiness. And then here is the passage I referenced before, the potato peeling passage. At the very top of the page there, she has a memory, a moment of lucidity, where she can remember sitting next to her mother as she's peeling potatoes. If you look at the top tier, Elodie's mother, or Judith's mother, she's called Judith in the book, picks up a first potato and then she starts to peel it. And then in the second tier, all the potatoes are peeled. And it's something that we as comics readers are totally used to. But it's something that utterly disorients Elodie Durand because she can't remember the interval between her mother picking up the first potato and starting to peel it, and then the bowl of potatoes at the end. And so there's this wonderful tension and contrast between the way closure works for us as readers, I'm sort of assuming that people have an experience similar to mine in reading this, and I know not everyone would, but and the way that the subject of the panel experiences the same thing. And so comics, excuse me, it's the similarity between the ways in which we, the readers of parenthesis on the one hand, and then Judith on the other, witness the potato peeling as a sequence of fragments, shows the contrast between our experiences and our perceptions of the process into high relief. In my opinion, it's an ingenious way of making Judith's orientation more accessible by showing that she is unable to commit the same act of closure that we are, or that when she does so, it's really confusing for her and bewildering for her, whereas we're so used to it. And this is something that I think is only really possible in comics. And so I think I'm going to move ahead to talking about the two comics from The Most Costly Journey, as promised. Both of the comics that we're going to be looking at were drawn by Tilly Walden over on the right-hand side. And the storytellers in them were Delmar and Laura, and those are both pseudonyms. So The Most Costly Journey, could I have a show of hands from folks who are familiar with that work already? Okay. All right, so a lot of folks were. And I recognize some folks from the book club meeting that we had here a month or so ago. But at any rate, it's a collection of comics, collaborations between migrant workers in the Vermont dairy industry. There's about 1,200 or so of them in Vermont, and Vermont cartoonists who've told their stories. And it's about two dozen comics in the collection. And they're all collaborations. They were all originally published in Spanish. And wonderfully, the storytellers had the chance to look at the comics that were drafted by the artists and then give feedback and ask for revisions to be made. The first comic in the collection is this one. It's called The Story of Delmar. And Delmar, he tells us, is from Chiapas, Mexico, and he's been in the United States for 7 years, and he emigrated, he says, when he was 15 years old. What's really interesting about this comic, or one of the really interesting things about it to me, is that Delmar's face never appears in full in the comic. As we see here, either his facial features are just left undrawn, as in that upper left-hand panel, or his back is to us. And then there's other cases where we'll just see a portion of his face. And that is a reminder of his daily reality as someone who needs to really carefully guard his visibility because of his status, his immigration status. And this here is one of my favorite pages in the collection. It's got a very short text at the top in the upper left-hand corner, which preserves the word that Delmar uses to describe the feeling of isolation he has. And that the collection, Most Costly Journey, was in part designed to help ameliorate. Was that it was hope. The hope was that people would be able to share their stories and learn from each other, hear the coping mechanisms that different people in similar situations have had. And so he says, I was also often encerrado, stuck at home or isolated. The size and shapes of the panel, I love the way that the shapes of the panels are all different on this page. There's about 4 or 5 of them, depending on how you count the first panel. And they all are there to help express the strong sense of confinement that Delmar feels. And so there's enclosure within rooms, particular rooms. There's enclosure with a hallway. There's enclosure with other people. And there's also, of course, enclosure within that picturesque New England farm in the snowscape. But even as the size of the panels increases as we move down the page, it's not because the sense of enclosure, it dissipates over the course of the comic. In fact, it sort of ends in this abstraction with darkness in the background of the main character. And so it moves wordlessly from one perspective to the next in order to sort of draw out the sense of isolation there. So I've said that was one of my favorite pages in the collection, and here's one of my favorite tiers in the collection. So on the top, we get the clearest image we ever get of Delmar's face, but of course it's only partial. And he tells us that at least the countryside of Vermont reminds me of the land back in Chiapas. And then on the bottom of this page, Tillie Walden juxtaposes two panels from two different times, thousands of miles apart. On the left-hand side, we get Del Mar as a younger child back in his hometown in Chiapas. And on the right-hand side, we get him in Vermont at the farm where he lives and works. And there's a gutter between the two that shows us the break, that shows us these are not the same place. But the ridge line of the mountains in the background is almost perfectly continuous. And so Tillie Walden has found a way to represent how these different fragments of Del Mar's life actually come together in a whole as he sees it. He, although he feels that strong feeling of isolation, is able to make sense out of his experience and is able to do what MacLeod says we readers of comics do, which is to take the fragments and make them into a whole. I wanted to talk lastly about the last comic in the collection, also drawn by Tillie Walden. And it's called What I've Planted Here. I mean, it's the story of Laura. In this comic, Tillie Walden does, I think, a wonderfully innovative thing with borders and frames and enclosures. And I think it's inspirationally creative what she does with it. And so the comic describes Laura's cultivation of a garden in a space between two barns where she lives. And she does this with the blessing of her boss and with the help of people who have come to visit and explain to her, here's how you can garden, here's how you prepare the soil, here's how you do it. Like many migrant dairy workers in Vermont, her boss is the same as her landlord. But she notices, she mentions in the very bottom left-hand panel that immigration always passes by the roads next to the farm. So it was really important that they make a space for the garden where she and her other family members would not be visible. So the garden expands both in size and repertoire from year to year, and it saves the family money, and it gives them access to herbs and to vegetables that Laura used to have to send away to Mexico for, or just to do without. And so she mentions them: papalo, cepiche, poblano peppers. And growing becomes a family project, a way for Laura to teach her daughter about planting and weeding, about growing and harvesting. And then she explains that it frees Laura from trapping herself in the kitchen in front of a television. Walden draws the television in that upper right-hand panel as a perfect square enclosed within the frame of the panel. It's blurry and dark, and it's overshadowed by the bright space, open space of the window, which we can only partially see. The television in this comic, which might seem like a really minor detail, contrasts sharply with the family's garden and the way that it's drawn. It sort of spills joyfully and even defiantly over its hard boundaries. The garden never appears in the comic in full. No panel ever contains it. We only ever see it in close-ups or in fragments. Each time it appears, at least a portion of it extends beyond the limit of the frame. In other words, to borrow from Del Mar's language from the previous comic we looked at, the garden is never encerrado within a panel. It's never isolated. So the caption in the first panel and the second tier on this page goes so far as to claim that the garden gives Laura and her family freedom. But in spite of these transcendent qualities, the comic is not naive about this sort of provisional and limited freedom that she gets. In that panel where we see the third panel, that is in the second tier, the first one there, first panel in the second tier, our view of the garden, which is incomplete as always, is blocked by what appears to be the wall of one of the barns. And it's a gentle reminder, but a very down-to-earth one, of the practical limits and the relative fragility of the freedom that Laura derives from her garden. Art Spiegelman, in a notebook sketch that he made in 2007, compares comic panels with coffins. He says, make boxes, fill them. Cartoonists and undertakers, same business. Comics is a tremendously flexible medium, and the meaning of its borders and its panels and its boxes and its bubbles is, of course, fluid and always dependent on context. Tillie Walden's drawing of the story of Laura suggests that comic panels can also figure and represent fertility, abundant life, growing gardens, as well as coffins, cleverly enough by failing to contain these things within the border of the panel. Thank you very much for listening and for participating. And if folks have questions, I'd be happy to take them.
First of all, thank you. Oh, fabulous.
Yes.
Is there like theory or an accepted practice in terms of this may be a two-part question, dealing with thought bubbles as something that is shared knowledge? In other words, we don't normally aren't privy to what people are thinking, and then is that paired or not paired with an idea of an unreliable narrator? In other words, can we trust the bubble?
See, it's a great question. Because thought bubbles look so much like speech bubbles, I think I'm probably less aware than I should be of the difference between those two things. But sure, yeah, there are certainly speech bubbles, or thought bubbles rather, that are untrustworthy and are marked as such and set up as such in comics. Yeah.
We buy a lot of graphic novels here, so I think of the genre as growing all the time. Do you understand the growth or the breadth of this part of literature? I think there's more and more of them. They're fabulous. I have favorite artists and authors. But I think I'm also a little blind because we buy a lot of them. We buy from this collection, so I'm not sure if it's a growing part of literature or it's a small segment that's out there.
It seems to be growing. I think I'm not sure what the market share is for publishing for graphic narrative, but I know it's growing. It's increasing. I think as print media, people start arguing that it's moving towards obsolescence. There is something so important about turning the pages of a comics codex, I think. You can't really quite, it's not the same for me scrolling through a laptop, and I think a lot of people agree. And my students, for example, do as well. They'll happily read PDFs and Word docs, but they prefer to have hard copies of books when they're reading. We do pleasure reading in my class, and they want books there. So my sense is that it's pretty broad, but I think I'm only beginning to scratch the surface of what's out there. There are, there's Elodie Duran's book. If I had a copy of it, it says named one of the 10 best graphic medical memoirs of this particular year, which. Okay, there's that many graphic medical memoirs from that year, and so it does seem like it's broadening, and there's all kinds of genres. I know that Aiden teaches or has taught a pamphlet that's made to explain the civic process in Vermont, also that's in comics form, right?
Yeah, Freedom and Unity.
Yeah.
Also through the Center of Cartoon Studies, which is affiliated with Chelsea. So yeah, I just taught that a few weeks ago.
And I'm hoping it leads people who are not perhaps reading, maybe this is a misperception of mine, young people, I don't think they're reading as much as, say, somebody my age did. I'm 64, so everybody read as a kid, your parents read to you, and I worry that maybe younger people are not, and I'm always hoping this is their entree to that. And also reluctant readers who may want to read well, that this gives them a way to enter reading legitimately. And I also think that graphic novels are like children's books. Like if you take a nice big children's book and you open it and you have a 2-page spread, whether it has these characteristics or not, that doesn't work on the phone, it doesn't work on the tablet. The book is a pretty good format for a lot of things. And I think that many of the graphic novels, so you could render a page like that on a screen, and I don't know, you get all of the information. I don't think you get the same effect, particularly if you have to scroll to say separate those 3 parts of the page.
Yes.
So I actually think they're also going to keep books alive going forward.
Right. And Spiegelman says something about, I think he says, comics are the last bastion of literacy. There's another quote I could have used here, which is kind of interesting. And an interesting counterpoint to what Frederick Wortham says about it being an evasion and almost the opposite of reading. But Aidan, did you have a question?
Okay, at the risk of turning this into more of a conversation than maybe you intend, I don't know if I would respond to a comment of Bob, so I just something that I also find interesting too with the entree piece, and while we're just talking about Freedom and Unity, which is a comic book intended to educate young people on the Vermont civic process, I personally found that teaching that, my 9th graders did better analysis of Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha than they actually did with the 26-page comic book, of understanding how this German author made choices to show these characters. I thought they got a better sense of it, intuitively, than they did with how the civic process is drawn and the particular choices that they made. So I actually found that they struggled with it more than what I would consider a pretty dense, obsolete text. Or not obsolete, but relatively impenetrable to the current 9th grade brain, I would say. And so I also find that to be interesting when I think about it.
As a person who has no business entering into that debate, since I teach no one, I have a theory about that, and that is that modern day textbooks, I think, have veered more towards comics in the sense that they have the blowout boxes that tell you the main idea of a page, or they have the different colors, and then they have fun drawings of key figures or whatever it is. And so I think there's something disorienting about a standard graphic narrative where you can't just find the biggest box and get the information from it. You actually have to follow a sequence and register in ways that are very much like traditional reading. You have to go left to right or top to bottom.
Yeah. So I was just kind of responding to that, where that analysis step is kind of missing for that.
Cool. Yeah. So I find that I need more practice teaching students how to read these pages as well. Sometimes it seems like, it's a nice break from the onerous work of reading something dense and difficult. But teaching McLeod's Understanding Comics in the fall did not go very well. My students complained bitterly about that work. I thought it was so accessible. I thought I did such a great job showing and telling at the same time. My students said, this is impossible to read. We don't understand this. Every class they came in, wringing their hands. It was nice that they came into class talking about the book we were reading, but it was not, they were not happy about it. And so I'm taking it a little differently this time, this fall. Mr. Ed, yeah.
Just to switch over to the kids have read it and been taught it, have you tried having them
Produce comics.
a few pages, a storyline with some of these techniques?
Yes. Yeah.
And?
That's what we do. Yeah. And that seemed to work. Their feedback form said otherwise at the end of the semester. Yeah, they were still complaining about understanding comics. But we did practice doing, self-consciously making comics about closure, for example. We did comics about weaving different timelines together. We did comics where, you have to use different size panel shapes all throughout the page for a particular purpose, and you have to decide what the purpose is and that kind of stuff. And so, that can be an effective way to do that, too.
9th and 10th grade.
We do it, I've done it as a single project with 9th graders. We read Mouse this year, and then last year we've also read Mouse in Humanities at St. Johnsbury. But with the graphic narrative course, we do a lot more of it over the course of the semester.
It's 12th grade.
How do you find the vocabulary from your reading of some of these high school level graphic novels? I think the tendency is to think that, because it's a graphic novel or a comic, they're dumbing down the vocabulary. However, are you finding the opposite to be true?
That the comics artists themselves are dumbing down?
Or that really, you have this stereotype of what a comic, it's just basic language, when in reality, have you been finding more sophisticated vocabulary in some of these, as opposed to, pow, bam, think about super
Alison Bechtel, I'm so looking forward to her talk in about a month, and her language is incredibly sophisticated. It's very literary, and it often incorporates whole excerpts from, I don't know, what's the name of that? Winnicott, the British psychoanalyst, and Are You My Mother, and Fitzgerald, and Wallace Stevens, and Funholm, and then Margaret Fuller, and Jack Kerouac, and Adrienne Rich, and others in her most recent book. And so, yeah, for her, I think the language is very sophisticated. And there's a lot of words that my students have to look up, especially in The Secret to Superhuman Strength. So,
I did a research project when I was in library school, and the author I chose was David Hilary, who does, the diaper baby, the potty language. And he said in the research I did on him, he said that he did not believe in dumbing down the language in some of the things he did, because he felt like reluctant readers, that was a draw for them, and that if they wanted to know what that word was, they would look it up. So he put in a lot more sophisticated vocabulary for children of that age. And I just think sometimes people think, oh, it's a comic, it's going to just be basic words. I mean, like very, elementary words. Whereas, someone really takes the time to read, especially some of these adult comics. It does sophisticated topics, sophisticated vocabulary. That's what I'm finding.
sure. Yes, I agree. Yes.
I have a question about a similar subject, about the vernacular in a single story with the comics. You get two different characters, and one is speaking in a British accent, or one is speaking in Americanese, and you get a whole different choice of words, as well as the spelling of each word's you instead of your instead of you, and do you teach any of that?
It's an interesting question. So in Mouse is a good example of where Vladek's speak. You can see that his syntax is a little different from Art's, let's say. And interestingly, my students will notice this too, or I'll point it out to them, try to draw it from them, that when Vladek is speaking to Art in the present tense, in the 1970s in Rego Park or in the Catskills, his language will be the language of someone who learned English later in life. But in the scenes that take place in the 30s, where he's actually speaking Polish or Yiddish or German, his English is perfect. And so there's a difference there, too. The first time I heard a recording of Vladek Spiegelman speak, I was amazed because he spoke so quickly. And even though I was used to imagining that his language might be slower because of the syntax not being quite right. But he's totally confident and quick in his speaking in his own version of English syntax. So, and in Mouse also there's one infamous passage where there's some I dialect. When in the present tense, Art and Francoise and Vladek are driving to a grocery store in the Catskills, and they pick up a hitchhiker who's African American, and that character's speech has a lot of apostrophes, a lot of sort of clipped off words. And so, yeah, that's also a place where you can sort of visually see the difference between the registers. Yeah.
And that broaches the question about field work. If you got me looking, not just looking, really having to search and dive into personalities to find colloquial expressions,
Right.
to fit ideas. And then suddenly something will go bing, the invisible bing, bong, and you will realize an idea has exploded out of that colloquial expression, which wasn't there originally.
Right.
I mean, you can get any number of ideas out of one colloquial expression, because that's how they developed.
Sure.
People back when, farming around, out on the road, they'd run into somebody or be at the mailbox, to get into a conversation, they only had so much time to talk. And one colloquial expression could mean a half a dozen different things, just cover a lot of experiences. And yet be very simple-minded in a sense, or universal. So how about something like that with teaching?
The teaching. Oh,
You need to recognize various different characters as if you're in a play.
I see. Yes, it doesn't come up too much in the comics classes that I've taught, but yeah. No, it's really great to get students to be attentive to language, and but yeah, trying any way I can to make that happen in the class. Well, I don't want to overstay our welcome here tonight. I know some folks have had a long day, and so thank you very much for coming, and thanks for having me. And all right, we'll have.
Great.